welcome to the program. It's a sad reality that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not simply a moment in time news headline that this program can avoid directly dealing with or talking about, because it has been a global reality and a trend for a long time. And it is at the center of so much of the international geopolitical conversation among European nations, among the United States, among Asian nations, and of course, the nations in the region of the Middle East and North Africa. So we felt it was important to do our best to have an academic conversation and take as much of the politics, the ideologies, and to some degree the emotions out of an extraordinarily difficult and emotional topic that has spanned generations, spans cultures, spans religions. So we do our best in this episode to do justice to the topic and to keep true to our mission here, which is to educate curious minds and to be as straightforward and unbiased as we can, despite all the sensitivities that a topic like this requires. And I believe we've accomplished that in our conversation today. My guest is Hussein Ibish. He is a senior resident scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. He is a weekly columnist for The National, former columnist for Bloomberg News, regular contributor to The Atlantic and The Daily Beast, and a frequent contributor to many other U.S. and Middle Eastern publications. He's made thousands of radio and television appearances and was the Washington, D.C. correspondent for the Daily Star out of Beirut. Many of Ibish's articles are archived on his Ibish blog website. His most recent book is What's Wrong with the One-State Agenda. It was published in 2009. Ibish was included in all 3 years, 2011, 2012, and 2013, of Foreign Policy's Twitterati 100, the magazine's list of 100 must-follow Twitter feeds on foreign policy. Ibish previously served as a senior fellow at the American Task Force on Palestine and executive director of the Hala Salam Maqsood Foundation for Arab American Leadership from 2004 to 2009. From 1998 to 2004, Ibish served as communications director for the Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee. He has a PhD in comparative literature from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. I think it's important as we go into this to ask a couple of things. Number one, I ask you, as I always do with our guests, to keep an open mind and an open heart, to listen and think for yourself. And we are not here to tell anybody what to think or what to believe. We are here to offer ideas and to have the most honest and straightforward conversation that we can by finding the best guests and the most educated and experienced experts that we can on the topic. But there is no guest who is informed on this topic that you could possibly find who is not going to have some perspective, some point of view that somebody will find upsetting or offensive. So just know that our intention in this show, as in all shows, is to be as even-handed as we can, to be education-oriented, to be thoughtful, to ask questions. And for anybody who listens to this program and would like me to have a different guest on to offer a different perspective, we are open to that. So please don't think that this is the authoritative end-all, be-all, only time we'll ever talk about this topic, and this is the only guest we'll do it with. We felt strongly that we found the right person to help us explore the topic in a historical context and in a reasonably thoughtful and informative way. And we believe that Hussein has done that for us. So I present this interview to you in the hope that you will find it as interesting and informative as I did, to help us reflect on it. And stick with me. At the end of the program, I'll have a few brief thoughts on this and an invitation for you to engage with me and with us on this important topic. So without any further delay, I present to you my conversation with Hussein Ibish, senior resident scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. Hussein, welcome to the program.
Great to be with you, Brian. Thank you.
All right, I've given a little bit of an introduction, but I would love for you to introduce yourself to our audience before we get into the conversation.
Sure. My name is Hussein Ibish. I've got a PhD from UMass Amherst in comparative literature. I'm a Lebanese American, and for the past 10 years, I've been working at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, specializing in international relations, foreign policy, and national security of the Gulf countries, in the Arab Gulf countries. And in addition, before that, I spent 10 years as a senior fellow at the American Task Force on Palestine, working very closely on Israeli-Palestinian peace and U.S. foreign policy, towards that. There's a whole bunch of my history before that, but I'll leave it alone.
Fair enough. Well, thank you for taking time to join us and speak with our audience. So, we're going to get right into the topics of the
Sure.
day. The Israeli Palestinian conflict, not new. It's been going on a long time, obviously took on a new dimension, and the globe has been refocused on it in the last several months.
Yeah.
One of the questions being asked in capitals all around the world is the feasibility now of a two-state solution, given the events of the last, let's call it the last year.
Yeah.
You're about as educated on this region and have looked at it as closely as anybody. Where do you feel we are in the path towards a two-state solution?
Yeah, I'm sorry to say that's probably true. I have spent a lot of time on it. Um, all right, so I mean, let's step back for a second and talk about what we're talking about. Let's talk about the context in which the two-state solution is viable or not viable. You have this single piece of land between the river and the sea, which is basically the British mandatory area of Palestine. After the First World War, the British and the French carved up the Middle East between them into zones of hegemony or imperial control called mandates. They got the League of Nations to sign off on this, even though the Arab countries that were involved in the Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire thought they were going to be independent and had documents, especially from the British, guaranteeing that they would be independent. They weren't. And the British really wanted Palestine, and the French didn't, so they got Palestine. They drew a border for the Palestine Mandate, and that has now become reified. It's only 100 years old, and yet it has become sacred. It is what many religious Israelis now call Eretz Israel, the Holy Land of Israel. They've allowed the British to divine their kind of patrimony from God, so to speak. And then there are Palestinians who have developed their own national narrative where this is historic Palestine and it's historically Arab, and it was more than 95% Arab when the British took control, and over that period between World War I and World War II became much, as a large Jewish community was formed and ended up in 1948 being more than 25% of the country, but demanding a partition with more than half of the country given to them. And so the idea of dividing this country was never positive from a Palestinian point of view, even though they would have been wise to accept the partition and try and make it work. I doubt it would have. But they would have been wise to at least try that, because they did not have the military strength to prevent the creation of the State of Israel and the concomitant dispossession and exile of 80% of the Arabs in the area that became Israel. But what you've ended up with then is 100 years of conflict and contest and confrontation between two ethno-national groups with competing and mutually exclusive ethno-national projects for total control of this little area between the river and the sea, British Mandatory Palestine. And throughout, you've had differing, percentages of population, but for a long time, it's been in this area that in 1967 was reunited. It got broken up in 1948 with significant chunks falling under the control of different Arab countries, especially the West Bank and East Jerusalem falling under Jordanian control and the Gaza Strip falling under Egyptian control. But less than 20 years later, that was reversed with the 67 war, and Israel was once again in possession of all of mandatory Palestine, plus the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights. They returned the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt in the peace treaty. They have annexed the Golan Heights from Syria. And the Trump administration signed off on that, making our lecturing of Russia about Ukraine a little bit more hollow, to say the least. You can throw in Western Sahara as well. The U.S. has seemed to back Morocco's claims to have annexed Western Sahara in the same way, and in exchange, specifically, for their normalization of relations with Israel. So it appears that Israel is the great carve-out from the UN Charter's prohibition on the acquisition of territory by war, and it can extend to other countries in the name of Israel. No, to guarantee Israel's security. Then Morocco can be a carve out too. So these two peoples have been struggling for land and power for the past 100 years, and really for the in an armed way for the past 80 years, and under Israeli control for the past 60 years, a little more. And there are equal numbers of Arabs and Jews in this territory, roughly 7 million of each. And the problem is that all of the Jewish Israelis, wherever they are in this de facto greater Israel in mandatory Palestine, are citizens with all the rights and responsibilities and protection of civil law and everything. Most of the Palestinians are not. 2 million are citizens of Israel, and they face significant discrimination in many areas, but they also have political rights and a vote and representation. And they have access to the government that rules them, albeit in a certain circumscribed way, but they do. The 5.5 million in the West Bank and Gaza do not, and in East Jerusalem. They are a very sui generis group of people because they're in their own country, they're in their own place, but they are not citizens of anything. They're not citizens of Israel, nor citizens of their own state, nor nothing. And so this is really now driving the conflict, is really the people don't talk about this enough, but it's a Palestinian quest for citizenship that has been for the past 25 years, 30 years, been driving their national struggle. The Israeli government has increasingly moved towards, and the Israeli polity as a whole, has been increasingly moving away from a two-state solution, which they dabbled with during the Oslo era in the early 90s, but never really moved much towards, and towards annexation. And then the question is, what do you do with the Palestinians there? So the only way to end the conflict and resolve it in a mutually acceptable fashion is a formula that would allow for self-determination of both these peoples, right? So that Jewish Israelis could have their own self-determination in their own Israeli or Jewish state, and Palestinians could also get self-determination, either through a binational state with Israelis, which I think is not workable at all, or through their own state, which Israel is increasingly making impossible. And by the way, baked into, this is the last thing I'm going to say, baked into the current coalition agreement is a statement, a flat-out statement that for this government, the current Netanyahu government, only Jews have a right of sovereignty and self-determination in Eretz Israel. Right? That's the word they use. Now, that's superfluous if they were talking about Israel, the state. That's already established by the nation-state law that was passed a few years ago. And the term for the Israeli state is Medinat Israel. But they didn't say Medinat Israel, they said Eretz Israel, which is the land of Israel. And it's obvious they didn't say Medinat Israel because they don't mean the state of Israel, they mean the whole shebang. They mean Israel and East Jerusalem and the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. They're clear on that. So they are categorically opposed to a two-state solution. Now, on the other side, the Palestinians recognized Israel. The PLO is the only group that speaks for the Palestinians internationally. Even Hamas recognizes that. We can talk about all that. That's important. But they recognized Israel in 1993. The core of Israeli-Palestinian diplomacy, the navel, the originating point of it, is a letter sent by Yasser Arafat in his capacity as chairman of the PLO to Yitzhak Rabin, Prime Minister of Israel, recognizing Israel and its right to live in peace and security, free from threats, etc. And Rabin replied with, as Prime Minister of Israel, with a letter to Arafat as chairman of the PLO, recognizing the PLO as a legitimate interlocutor and undertaking to negotiate with it. That does not. So Israel has never recognized the Palestinian right to a state, let alone a Palestinian state. And right now, that's a big bone of contention with Saudi Arabia and a potential triangular deal with the United States. It looks pretty grim for a two-state solution. But what I want to say is, unless we, the Israelis, the Palestinians, the international community, want this conflict to continue indefinitely with more October 7s and worse, and more Gaza conflicts and worse, um, we're going to have some version of a two-state solution, whether it's two um, broken states, like in former Yugoslavia, Croats here, Serbs there, and they exchange embassies, or whether it's in a confederation or some other hybrid model. The war will not end until Palestinians get citizenship and Palestinians have some means of expressing their self-determination, and not in Jordan, in Palestine itself. So I'm going to end there. I'm going to say the idea doesn't go away because it's the only workable formula to end the conflict through agreement. Otherwise, you get more death and dying, and there's no way out. Every other formula, whether it's Israel's totalizing greater Israel with very few Palestinians given rights, or Hamas's dream of an Islamic state from the river to the sea, or any other formulation, it doesn't work. Or even a single state with everyone voting and everyone happy and brothers and all that. But there's no narrative for it. There's no name for it. It's not workable in this generation or the next generation. So a two-state reality is the only one that can end the conflict by agreement.
Now, we know that in both sides of this conflict, getting agreement, even if there was a peace deal on the table,
Yeah.
getting all Israelis to align to it, getting the factions on the Palestinian state and the Arab states together would be a challenge.
Yeah.
And it feels like both sides have this issue. Who are the leading voices on either side of this that are striving towards either a two-state solution or at least some sort of bridge to that? Because
Yeah.
honestly, the loudest voices today on both sides seem to
Right.
be those who are simply saying, we fight on.
Absolutely. No, I mean, that without a doubt, they are the loudest voices. They are the most credible voices, and they are the voices that excite the most passionate interest. But one of the reasons for that is that after the Second Intifada was the great inflection point. It occurred immediately following the failure of the Camp David summit in July of in August, at least sometime in the summer of 2000. I forget the month, but with Arafat and Barak and Bill Clinton. And that was a total failure, and it was a failure on all sides. The Israelis came with a totally unworkable plan that denied Palestinians real statehood. The Palestinians came without a counteroffer. They came up with a counteroffer later, but they didn't have a meaningful counteroffer at the time. And so that was a big failure. And then Bill Clinton had a good bridging proposal, which is the Clinton parameters, which he kept in his pocket. And instead of pulling it out and bridging, he kept demanding the Palestinians accept the Israeli formula that was not workable. So dumb, dumber, and dumbest, in my view. And in that order. And the Israelis were dumb, the Palestinians were even dumber, and Clinton was the one who really screwed up because he had a potential solution. And he kept it in his pocket until later. And when he pulled it out and talks resumed quietly in Taba and elsewhere, it was too late. And it didn't work. And the Second Intifada slowly developed, and that was very violent. And a lot of people got killed, much more Palestinians than Israelis, but enough Israelis to traumatize Israel. With the suicide bombings and all of that that began in January, February of 2001, which I was a big critic of. But still, it really traumatized both peoples and their supporters on either side, killed the Israeli peace camp, wrecked up Palestinian confidence in the Israeli desire for peace, obviously on the other side as well. So both sides started turning to maximalist formulas, whether a complete state of their own or a binational state they anticipate controlling on the part of the pro-Palestinian advocates of that. One of the reasons it's so appealing to them is not just that they love equality. It's that they expect Palestinians eventually to control that state because they expect there to be more of them. And they think that demography is destiny, and they haven't learned a thing from human history, not one blessed thing. I mean, they're just as out of it as you could imagine. Yeah, on the other hand, it's still the case that the PLO, represented by the aging, I mean, he sort of does embody the condition of the institutions he represents. But Mahmoud Abbas, who's in his late 80s, who's a chain smoker in terrible health, who could not have possibly made a bigger mess of his role as head of the PA and head of the PLO, nonetheless, he remains steadfast for a negotiated two-state solution. He's opposed to violence. His security forces still work closely with the Israelis in the West Bank, despite everything, to try to tamp down violence. And if they want a credible partner, they just won't get a better one than him, even though he's sort of useless from a kind of a physical and even in a way political point of view. If they made a two-state solution plausible and viable, either he would snap back to life or someone else would replace him, because it would be very popular among Palestinians. Palestinians are desperate. They need a solution. They don't believe it exists, but their main institution is still committed to it. Hamas claims to represent the Palestinians, and October 7 is an effort for them to gain control of the movement. They were formed during the first Intifada in 1987, when there was a vacuum of leadership for complicated historical reasons I'll blow off here. But there was a vacuum of leadership and an uprising on the ground in the occupied territories led by ad hoc committees, kind of Gramscian committees of resistance and correspondence. And the Brotherhood in Gaza saw a vacuum. The PLO was gradually coming back into the West Bank, but they founded Hamas to challenge the PLO and Fatah, and to say, no, the Palestinian cause is not a secular nationalist cause, it's an Islamist cause, and it should be led by us, not you. And that was the goal, and they haven't achieved that yet. And the main reason they haven't achieved it is the PLO still speaks for Palestinians on the world stage. Every time a Palestinian gets up at the Arab League, at the UN General Assembly, in the ICJ, in the ICC, which the Palestinians are present in all these multilateral institutions, because the PLO became the state of Palestine at the General Assembly, a non-member observer state. That gave them access to things like the ICC and the ICJ, the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice, which is looking at charges against Israeli leaders and Hamas leaders in terms of the ICC, and charges against Israel for genocide in the ICJ. The only reason these groups have these multilateral agencies have any jurisdiction in these matters is that the state of Palestine acceded to the treaties that govern them through their membership in the UN General Assembly as the state of Palestine. So no one challenges the PLO's legitimacy, even Hamas. But what Hamas wants to do is take it over. So still, the voice of a two-state solution speaks for Palestinians. The problem is, on the Israeli side, anger over the Second Intifada and the widespread belief that Palestinians don't want peace and the only language they understand is violence and all of that has given way to grasping, territorially avaricious irredentism on the part of the Israeli right and even the Israeli center, with a determination to keep hold of most, if not all, of the West Bank because of its religious significance, which is much greater than most of Israel. It's really greater than the Galilee, greater than the Negev Desert, greater than Tel Aviv, actually, which is a greenfield site. There was nothing really there before the late 19th century when Jewish settlers formed it. It's sort of meaningless in biblical terms, whereas most of the West Bank is very meaningful, or historical irredentist terms, or in terms of strategic thinking, where the Jordan Valley becomes this really important strategic area. So they want to grab it, and they don't want to give it back. And the problem is they don't want to incorporate the people or give the people any meaningful rights. And so this is where we are. We are headed on, we've been, since 2000, we've been on a very slow train that's gained speed. And it's become a faster, it's not a bullet train yet, but it's an express train towards a station called annexation slash expulsion. And I think there are a lot of people in the Israeli government now, today, who are waiting for an explosion of violence in the West Bank that would give them the opportunity to seize a lot of the territory and expel a lot of the Palestinians who live there, maybe into other pockets of the West Bank or something, and say they do this with the utmost regret. It's the last thing they would ever want to do, but that someone has to be the adult here. A divorce is necessary. They have to bite the bullet, and they cried and they went to therapy and all of that, but they had no choice. And it's in everyone's interest, and the world should thank them. You can hear the script. So, that's, I think, one of the main reasons that violence has not spread in a major way in the West Bank, despite all these provocations from the Israeli military and from armed settler groups that are increasingly resembling the Ku Klux Klan, frankly, in the way they operate and their logic and their ethos. Um, but the Palestinians are not really responding. It's partly because the PA remains committed to maintaining calm, and also because Palestinians I think they realize that if they rose up in anything like what Hamas did, or just simply took up arms against the Israeli military and armed settlers, they would find themselves expelled. This is very much on the table. I think the rest of the world is kind of blind to how close we are to this. But I think a lot of Palestinians in the West Bank are not, and it helps keep them calm because they don't want to give them this excuse. On the other hand, angry young men with no future, no rights, no nothing, but they do have guns, ultimately will probably give the Israeli extremists what they want. And we'll see what happens then.
So let's talk about the role of the regional players here.
Yeah,
So obviously, this is the intersection of not only American foreign policy, the Europeans have a say in this, but you've got large powers like Iran that have a significant influence in this part of the world. Saudi Arabia has interests in this part of the world. There are other players who, certainly the neighbors, Jordan and Egypt,
yeah,
you mentioned them earlier. Can you talk a little bit about the current role that they are playing? Let's start with the
yeah,
regional. We'll take the U.S. in a separate question.
yeah, yeah.
For now,
Well,
the regional players, the immediate neighbors.
there's not much any of them can do because, first of all, um, no one is going to go to war with Israel or really provoke the Israelis. They're very strong militarily. No one wants to get into a war with the Israelis. The second thing is nobody much likes Hamas. Iran supports Hamas and gives them arms and money. And they appreciate Hamas's role as a kind of a hemorrhoid for Israel, if you can put it that way, as a really irritating problem, medical problem for the Israeli state. And so far, October 7th, from an Iranian point of view, has been almost all benefit with very little cost. But they're never going to confront Israel over Gaza. Neither Hezbollah, Iran's closest enemy and trump card in the region, whose role, now that the Syrian war is over, is to deter attacks on Iran's homeland and especially on its nuclear facility. They're not going to waste any of their trump cards on a place that is insignificant to them, Gaza. It has no historical, religious, cultural significance. It only pulls heartstrings among Palestinians, some Israelis, a lot of Israelis, and some Egyptians. That's it. Beyond that, no one cares about Gaza. It's just, you could say Nairobi or something. It's just meaningless. It's just a place somewhere else. Doesn't have any significance the way, say, East Jerusalem, occupied East Jerusalem and the holy places there would. Um, or for an ally, Hamas, which is fundamentally unreliable. Hamas is not a good fit in the Iranian alliance. Hamas is a Muslim Brotherhood party, Sunni fundamentalists. The Iranian alliance is almost entirely a Shiite alliance otherwise, and with the Alawite government of Syria, an unhappy partner. Unhappy because Iran and Hezbollah have too much control in Syria now. But essentially, it's a Shiite alliance. And Hamas did break with Iran and Hezbollah and all the others during the Syrian war. They had to flee Syria. They had to flee. The Politburo of Hamas had been expelled from Gaza, ended up in Syria. They had to run away from Syria in 2012, leaving all their money, which is mainly in real estate, both party money and individual money, bound up in Syrian real estate. They just abandoned it, ran to Qatar, and which was a safe place for them, where they've been. I expect they'll have to leave Qatar sooner rather than later, for various reasons. But the point is that Hamas broke with Iran and its allies. So Iran and Hezbollah are not going to go to war for an unreliable ally. It's a marriage of convenience. Um, so they will kind of give lip service and money and guns, but they're not going to put anything valuable on the line. They're trying desperately not to have an Israeli invasion of Lebanon, which would, I think, some Israelis hope, turn the tables and make post October 7 a strategic liability for Iran, not for Israel, by severely degrading Iran's major weapon in the region, which is not Hamas, but it is Hezbollah. Hezbollah is tightly integrated into the Revolutionary Guard Corps Quds Force, which is the expeditionary wing, which has close relations with Hamas, but Hamas will never obey them. Hamas does not take orders from them. They won't do it. They're not close enough. Hezbollah certainly does and will and would. And so they're not going to do that. Now, the other regional powers have little that they can do. The UAE has said that it would be part of a post-conflict stabilization force, but I think that's largely because they expect that won't happen, and also they know they can't do it on their own and no one else is biting. The Saudis have had the main important reaction, which is to up the price for a recognition of Israel. The Saudis were negotiating with the Americans on a new peace treaty, a new mutual defense treaty, modeled after the ones the U.S. signed in the 50s with South Korea and especially Japan. And that negotiation is concluded. It's been agreed, but it would need to be ratified by the Senate. And to get ratified by the Senate, Saudi Arabia would have to normalize with Israel. And before the Gaza invasion, Saudi Arabia was asking for a package of strengthening the PA, some good words, and putting a lot of money into the West Bank to really strengthen Fatah. And that's what they wanted from Israel. Expanded role from the PA. They wanted them to do things to make things better for Fatah and to put the finger on the scale of Palestinian politics, which was so evenly divided between Fatah and Hamas, squarely on the side of Fatah. That's one of the big reasons that Hamas acted on October 7th. It was related to these negotiations, as people think, but it was not, as they go on to speculate, designed to save Iran from this agreement. It was designed to save themselves from their rivals in Ramallah getting all this money and benefits and things in the first real advance for Palestinians, as limited as it was going to be, in decades. And Fatah could have claimed credit for it. And among poor people, when you have food and medicine and healthcare for grandma and a new school for Johnny, you get a lot of brownie points, right? You got to have that. Good ideas don't cut it in impoverished societies. You got to have some patronage. You got to have some goodies. So they were going to get a bunch of it, and Hamas acted to stop that. Now with the war, the risk for Saudi Arabia has gone up. But like any commodity, the price is passed on to the consumer, right? And in this case, the consumer is Israel and the United States. And the price now involves Israel recognizing the Palestinian right to a state, which they have never done, going back to those letters I referred to, right, where the Palestinians did recognize Israel and Israel recognized the PLO as an interlocutor. The Saudis now want the Israelis to recognize formally that Palestinians have a right to a state. Not recognize a state, not demarcate its boundaries, nothing like that, just the right to a state. And they want Israel to commit, in theory at least, to getting into a process that is designed to eventually create a Palestinian state, establish one, without putting anything else on the line. And they want the Gaza war to end, but so do a lot of Israelis. Now, look, any normal Israeli government would jump at this, right? Because it would strengthen their ties with the U.S. It would create a ring of pro-American countries with relations with each other, beginning with the UAE, swinging all the way around the Arabian Peninsula, past the great choke point of the Strait of Hormuz, all the way around the Arabian Sea, up into the Gulf of Aden and the Bab el-Mandab Strait, which is the second big choke point, and up the Red Sea into the Suez Canal. These are 3 of the 8 global maritime choke points of significance. That's a huge number. And they are the arteries of the Chinese economy. More than 45% of their imported oil comes through the Strait of Hormuz, and more than 40% of their manufactured goods aimed at Europe and North America go through the Bab el Mandeb Strait and the Red Sea. These are the arteries in and out of the heart of the Chinese economy. It's rather a big competitive advantage in global great power competition with China. So it's very valuable to the United States, but they don't. To solidify this ring, they need the Israelis and the Saudis to have relations with each other and get into a partnership to bring this all together. They would be the twin pillars. And it's not happening because the Israelis will not say yes, because they fear if they do agree to the Palestinian right to a state, this big plan of a greater Israel and annexing much or most of the West Bank becomes impossible. They will have committed not to do it, committed to the Americans, committed to the Saudis, gotten the Senate to ratify a new big treaty, the first big mutual defense treaty with the US and a non-democracy since the Japan South Korea ones in the 50s. It's a very big deal. Um, the Israelis won't agree. And so this is where we are now. The Saudis are demanding something very valuable for the Palestinians, and the Israelis won't go for it. And it only demonstrates what I was saying about the way we're on a fast track to annexation and expulsion. Look, when human beings are in small groups and when they're individuals, they can often display enlightened self-interest. But when they're in big collectivities, identitarian collectivities like national groups, it is extremely rare. Most of the time, big groups of people behave like toddlers. And if they really, really, really want something and no one can stop them from taking it, you know what toddlers do? They take it. And I really think this is what's going on with Israel and the West Bank. No one can stop them from taking it. And they are determined to take it. There's no pressure, there's no penalty, there's nothing. They just have to do it in a slow and careful way. But they're doing that. And I think the end game we can see is going to be catastrophic unless someone can stop them and bring back the prospect of a two-state solution, maybe in the form of a confederation. There's nothing wrong with that. But their plan does not involve Palestinian self-determination in Eretz Israel.
So let's talk about the United States' role in this and the U.S. foreign policy. We have, as we're recording this program, we're about 2 months away from the U.S. federal election. We have two different visions of the world represented by the Republican candidate Donald Trump, former President Trump, and the current Vice President Kamala Harris. From your point of view, do you think that the outcome of that election will have a direct impact on the next stage of this conflict? And how do you think the Israeli and Palestinian sides are viewing the U.S. election?
Well, I think Hamas doesn't care. I think the PA obviously be very much hoping for a Democrat to win because they've already seen Trump invite Israel to annex 30% of the West Bank in his so-called peace proposal, Peace to Prosperity, uh, allegedly authored by Jared Kushner, which was issued in January of 2020, uh, which was a hideous cut and paste, undergraduate C paper, frankly. It was terrible. It was all mishmash of previously done garbage. But it did suggest that Israel could and should annex 30% of the West Bank, including the Jordan Valley, creating a greater Israel surrounding a potential Palestinian entity. It was a peace killing deal. It was an anti-peace masterpiece. And so he cut off the Palestinians. His solution for dealing with the Palestinians was to cut them off completely, cut off all aid, cut off aid to UNRWA, which cares for all the Palestinian refugees, including in Gaza, cut off all aid to the PA, including security support. It was madness. It was madness. I mean, I think he was thinking of this in terms of a land deal. I think he was thinking, well, if you turn off all the services for the tenants, then they'll agree to move out or something, which is not, he's not expecting people to leave, but it's that idea that you cut the electricity, you cut the water, and then finally they'll come and sign your deal. I mean, something like that. And they just cannot rely on him for anything other than the back of the hand, frankly. The other thing is he's totally unpredictable, right? Trump does not do policy. He doesn't have any ideology except a few things: the anti-trade, anti-immigration, and he's a big racist and a misogynist. And those are constants in his life. But other than that, it's whatever his policies are driven by politics, which is on a 12-hour news cycle. And it's whatever he thinks his base will like on Fox News that evening. And it's very ad hoc, which is how you can go from fire and fury like the world has never seen to I'm in love with Kim Jong un in a couple of months. It's insane. But if you're just thinking in terms of what looks good on TV, then it makes sense. Ditto with the JCPOA. I think if he'd negotiated the JCPOA, he would have called it the greatest thing of all time. But because it was done by Obama, it had to be the worst thing ever. And he had to rip it up. So this is the way the guy thinks. And I just think no one can have any confidence in him. The Israelis want him because he was good to them last time. And I'm not even sure they can be confident about what they'll get out of him. So who knows? With Harris, I think the Israelis fear her orientation, which is a traditional American internationalist view, strong on alliances, strong on international toughness, strong on order. I mean, if you're to listen to her rhetoric, she's more of that than Biden was, even. And she used this phrase in her speech at the convention. She said the U.S. had to have the strongest and most lethal military in the world. That most lethal is not really Democratic Party rhetoric, but it's her rhetoric. So she's trying to portray herself as quite a tough leader who is completely comfortable with the use of kinetic force. And she may well be that. I see no reason to think that it's just BS. Why? I mean, I think you take people seriously. When they say something, believe them. I'm a big proponent of that. So I think Harris is probably appealing to the Gulf countries in that sense. They fear remnants of the Obama administration, but they shouldn't. That tendency was already half gone under the Biden administration. I think it's going to be even further gone in the Harris administration. And I think that the only interesting thing is that the Iranians also would like a Democrat to come back because of the unpredictability of Trump. It's not that they're scared of him because he's so tough. It's that they're scared of an America that's totally unpredictable. And so I think when you get into it, the Israelis want Trump. And a few extremists in the Gulf countries want Trump, but mostly people in the Middle East will probably be more comfortable with Harris in the end because she's predictable and she represents a continuation of the American foreign policy that began after the Second World War.
And I'm curious how, as a policy expert, you read the next generation, let's say, of American voters, particularly in the Democratic Party, who were very outspoken against President Biden's policy, pro-Israel, we'll call it, despite philosophical differences with the government.
He was pro-Israel. I mean, he gave the Israelis an incredibly wide berth in Gaza. Now, I think, first of all, I'll get into the generational thing, but it is worth clarifying how I read the Biden policy on Gaza, because I have a slightly more nuanced view of it. I'm appalled by it, but I do not think it was immoral. Biden did not want large numbers of Palestinian casualties, even though that happened and he abetted it. What he wanted was to keep the war from spreading. What he wanted, the whole purpose of American policy after October 7 was like Las Vegas. What happens in Gaza stays in Gaza. In other words, the idea was that short of, a real genocide where, half the population is killed, or some huge massacre of 20,000 people in a day or something, that the U.S. could probably manage the fallout of anything that happened in Gaza. But that if the war spread, in particular spread to Lebanon, involving Hezbollah and Iran and U.S. forces, especially naval forces right off the coast of Lebanon and Cyprus, and all of that, that it could be unmanageable and it could spiral out of control and be the first major regional war in the modern Middle East and just be a disaster. And so I think it was an amoral policy rather than an immoral policy. It was designed to fit a rational security goal based on raison d'etat, that had no correspondence to human life or anything like that. It was about preserving broader order. That's how I read it. So I think it was defensible from the point of view of amoral statecraft, and indefensible from the point of view of human values. But often statecraft and human values are in conflict. So that's how I read it. It's a little bit more of a sympathetic reading than you'd get from a lot of Arabs, but that is my view of it. Now, the way in which the generations plan out, let's take the Republicans out of it altogether, because there you get into a lot of religious fundamentalism. A lot of the Republican views on Israel and its neighbors are driven by biblical freakout and apocalyptic mania. And I just don't want to deal with it because it's too weird. And I don't think, even under Trump, it would be driving foreign policy. The U.S., ever since Reagan, when the fundamentalists first were a power, I mean, they were there under Carter, but they weren't really strong. Under Reagan, they have, and ever since, they've been kept away from foreign policy. You'll note there has never been, maybe Mike Pompeo is the only fundamentalist who has been a foreign policy leader in the United States, and he was disastrous. But generally speaking, they've been kept away from state, away from NSC, kept on, social issues, domestic issues, etc. And there's a reason for that, is that they're dangerous lunatics. I think everyone else knows it. So they've been kept away. And I don't think they'd be front and center in a Trump administration, but they'd be lurking there. So I take the Republicans out. The Democrats break down not into two generational divides, but into three. There's the older generation of octogenarians and septuagenarians, who, I mean, like Trump and Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, and what have you, Jewish and non-Jewish, who, as Cold War liberals, got an admiration for Israel as a liberal bastion somehow in their mother's milk. They are emotionally attached to Israel based on a myth that Israel is a democracy and a liberal country. That's entirely a myth, frankly, given the occupation. I mean, it might be arguable if the occupation didn't exist, but it has, and it does. And they just were blind to it, and they love the Israelis. So that helps to explain Biden's support for Israel as well. And there are other factors too. The second generation, the middle-aged people like Blinken and Sullivan and Brett McGurk and Barbara Leaf, they are not as emotionally connected to Israel, but they buy the rhetoric. They buy the analysis that the special relationship between Israel and the United States is a significant strategic asset. So they want to protect it. And they like the relationship on strategic grounds and ideological grounds, not emotional grounds, right? And then you've got the under 35s, or under 40s or under 35s, who are skeptical of all of that. They don't have any emotional attachment to it. They don't see Israel as a liberal state of any kind, and they're right not to. And they don't buy the special relationship line either. And they're just wondering, why are we aiding and abetting this massacre? I mean, this is a war of vengeance, right? On October 7th, Netanyahu promised a mighty vengeance for October. That's a direct quote. And that's the one and only thing that's been achieved in Gaza. Right? Hamas is not destroyed, cannot be destroyed. This was a quixotic, ridiculous idea. It's been smashed up, but this is what Hamas wanted. If the Israelis stick around in Gaza, Hamas gets exactly what it wants, which is a long-term insurgency, which will give it every week a set of bloody shirts it can wave and claim to be the vanguard of the Palestinians, because they alone are fighting and dying for control of Palestinian land against Israeli occupiers here in Gaza, whereas the guys in the West Bank are the gendarmerie of the occupation, as I described, and the PLO sits at an empty negotiating table waiting for Israelis who never come, and bad things happen if they ever do. So they are the leaders. So they actually want this, right? But what I think is that, you got to understand that this war of vengeance did not appeal as a legitimate response to October 7th, to these under 35s, under 40s. What they saw was a war of vengeance, a savage war of vengeance. A lot of them called it genocide. I think if the casualty figures that we have are right, and they're increasingly scientists are saying it's way off, maybe by a factor of 10 or more. And if that's true, then it has been a genocide. But the official numbers mean genocide is a hyperbolic term, but it's been a series of massacres and a war against Gaza as a whole. It's Gaza delenda est. Okay, if anybody knows, if your readers know what I mean, and if they don't, they should look it up, because that's been the message. And people, a lot of people who aren't emotionally attached to Israel and don't buy the special relationship line, we're like, why are we abetting a savage war of vengeance? October 7 was bad, and there are many things that could be done about it, but this just smashed the place to pieces is crazy. And if young people had not responded like that, there would have been something wrong with them. Honestly, any young person who's politically active and shrugged at this war has a problem. There's something wrong with their moral compass.
So, with about 60 seconds left, want to close with this. What about this conflict are you looking at that you do not think is being accurately reflected in reporting or in mainstream news? What are we
Yeah.
missing?
The biggest single thing is the extent to which it is the Israelis that have been driving a potential conflict with Hezbollah in Lebanon. In 2006, that was a Hezbollah war all the way. I'm not carrying any water for Hezbollah. I can't stand them. They're a cancer on Lebanese society. So I'm not a Hezbollah guy at all. I mean, the opposite. But Hezbollah's role here was to spring into action on October 7 and not do what Hamas expected and hoped for, which was come in on their side. But they did increase the rocket fire into Israel within the accepted terms of engagement since 2006 and really since 2000 across that border. In other words, within a mile radius of the border on either side, and with limited casualties and aiming mostly, almost entirely at that point, at military targets. And the Israeli response has been to escalate at every stage. And they have escalation dominance, which is a position you want to be in, because the Israelis can, even the most sort of anti-war Israeli can see some potential benefits in it. They just don't fear this war. And they know that Hezbollah and Iran do fear this war. And they don't want anything to do with this war for the reasons I explained. It's just, there's nothing in it for them. And some Israelis hope that they could deliver a blow to Iran that would reverse the strategic balance after October 7 and make it more costly to Iran than to Israel, and also restore the damaged credibility, the crisis of credibility of the Israeli security state after the failures of October 7, that Hezbollah is a much more conventional adversary, and you could go into Lebanon and smash it up and come out with a quantifiable list of things you destroyed and why that's better for Israel. And you took the number of missiles and rockets down from 150 to 20,000, and you blew most of them up, and the launching pads are not there, and you killed 80% of their commanders. God knows what you want. But the hope is you could do that. Now, the problem is, of course, it won't go that way. And I think the biggest voices initially for this idea back in October and early October were Defense Minister Gallant and National Security Advisor Hanegbi. And they've soured on the idea because they've seen how exhausted the army is after Gaza, and they feel that this war is not necessary now. It could be done later. The other side doesn't want it. So why do it now? There are other voices saying, no, now is the time. The Americans are here. They've promised to protect us if we are attacked. They're right off the coast. We ought to do it now. Iran isn't a nuclear power yet. We got to take out their friends right now. We got to do it now. And that voice is very strong. And I don't think it's been appreciated enough in the mainstream reporting, the extent to which Hezbollah has been pulling its punches and backing away at every stage since October 7 and 8. And Israel has been the one, pushing forward. Now, they're using escalation dominance to try to collect gains, on the ground, in reality, or even at the negotiating table, without a war, and that's so gratis. In other words, easy victories. So far, they haven't got much, and I'm afraid that number one, the voices for war will win out, and we'll get one. And number two, I'm afraid of what can happen when people play chicken with flying bombs. And we saw that already in the Golan Heights when Hezbollah, obviously by mistake, killed 15 Syrian Druze teenagers and children in a soccer field. They didn't intend to do that. That was totally against their interests. It happened because they're playing chicken with flying bombs, and the Israelis are doing it too. A lot of that has happened in Lebanon, but no one cares. It doesn't really get any press. But the point is that things can go south very quickly, and I'm really worried about this. So I think people should pay attention to whether Israel presses the issue or not in Lebanon. I would urge you. That's the question of the moment more than anything else, I think.
It's been a fascinating conversation. I know you got to run. Thank you so much for taking so much time to speak with our audience about this today.
Thank you, Brian. It's been great to be with you. I really appreciate the opportunity.
As I said in the open to this show, it is practically impossible to find anybody knowledgeable on the ins and outs of the Middle East, from its history to its inner workings to the characters and players involved. Anybody involved either from a government perspective, an academic perspective, a research perspective, a cultural perspective, or any other. It is practically impossible to find anybody who doesn't have a perspective. And certainly for those who follow Hussein online, who follow Hussein on Twitter, for example, I'm sure there'll be commentary that you may look at for some people who will find his views biased, who will find his background to be that of somebody who's not an honest broker in the situation. But my objective in this show was to bring on a guest who had deep knowledge of the region, and we could talk about things at a level that paid respect to the honest history as things have played out, that got us to where we are, a relatively fair assessment of where we are, and the likelihood of where things are going. And I believe our interview did accomplish that. I ask everybody who disagrees with any of my guests, or who disagrees with me for that matter, we can disagree, and we don't have to dislike each other, and we don't have to throw each other out as unlistenable or somebody that we don't want to hear from. The objective of this show, as I think all good podcasts, is to have a dialogue, to offer ideas to the world that you may not hear anywhere else. And we think we accomplished that in this episode. So if you disagreed with everything that you heard, that's okay. I'm glad that you heard it. I'm glad that you had an open mind and an open heart to listen to it. If there's somebody that you would like me to have a conversation with and ask the very same questions to see if there's a different perspective or a different answer, I am open to it. Please reach out to me. I want to hear from you. Leave comments on my YouTube channel. Reach out to me on Twitter. I'm at Brian J. Matos on X, formerly known as Twitter. Reach out to me on Facebook. Reach out to me through email, info at brianjmatos.com. I want to hear from you. I want to hear your thoughts, and I want to hear your recommendations, and I want to hear your suggestions. But this is a public forum for conversation for those who are curious about the world around them and who want to learn more about the situations in our environment and how they got to be where they are. And for those who are seeking information to make decisions about how they're going to run their business or how they're going to think about who they are going to support politically. We want people to be as educated as they can be and to have as many perspectives. In the end, you make up your own mind. In the end, you vote whoever you want to vote for. In the end, you support whatever cause you want to support. We're not here to influence any of that. We're simply here to help educate, and we're here to offer perspectives, and we are here to do the best that we can to give an accurate picture from people who are in a position to know of what is happening and why it's happening and why the trend means something and matters. Now, having said all of that, I want to offer just one perspective, and it is only the perspective of a curious mind, of an observer in this world, of somebody who has no direct ties to the region and holds no position of authority on behalf of any government or any group anywhere. This is truly an individual with an open mind and an individual who cares about his fellow man and who simply wants to think about the prospects for a more peaceful world over time. We have to begin any discussion about the future, whether it's a flawed or an ideal picture of the future. with the idea that the current situation has nothing about it that leads to an inevitable finale. It is not inevitable that the Jewish people living in Israel and the Palestinians living in the West Bank and Gaza and the Arab states that surround this territory, there is nothing inevitable that they will all be destined to fight forever. There is also nothing inevitable that somehow, without an extraordinary compromise that has to be built on trust that is nowhere to be found today, it is not inevitable that these two people will live together in perfect harmony and peace. And it is also not inevitable that this confrontation has to end in some cataclysm that requires the dislocation or the death of potentially hundreds of thousands or millions of people. There is no inevitable outcome. There are only a wide range of possibilities. The truth, the hard truth of any conflict as intractable as this one, though, is that while outside forces can exacerbate or help the situation along, no outside force, not from Europe, not from the United States, not from Asia, not from any part of the world, is going to be able to solve the challenges of the people who live in this region for them. It is a responsibility and an obligation for all interested parties who have any role to play to always be striving towards a more peaceful future. But there can be differing views about how to get there. But we begin by understanding that it is only the people who will live in this part of the world, who will raise their kids, grandkids, and 5 generations of their family here. It is only the people who are there today who are going to be able to decide what that peaceful future looks like and how they're going to get there. It is not for me to say how long that will take. It's not for me to guess when a leader or leaders will rise to the occasion. It is only for me to say this as an observer of history. Out of this chaos, there will rise leaders. It won't be a single individual. There will rise leaders who are ready to meet the historical challenge and who are prepared to work as hard as any world leaders have ever worked to bring their people to the table to find a permanent and lasting peace that will be historic in its own achievement. And it will require historic negotiating skills. It will require a degree of commitment and difficult compromises that we have rarely ever seen, no matter how intractable any civil war you may have ever seen or any other form of conflict. It will be difficult, but the people who will do this are the greatest of the leaders who may not even have been born yet. But I, as an observer, really look forward to who those individuals might be. Because 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now, however long it is that we finally are able to look back on this chapter and look back on a time when the conflict started to abate and an enduring peace began to endure, we will look back on that time and we will find that there were individuals who rose above themselves and what they thought their limits were to achieve that peace and to bring their people along. Being a wartime leader is extremely difficult, but being a wartime leader that brings a war to an end and turns the chapter into peace and then making the transition to a reconciliation leader is perhaps the most difficult leadership goal that there can be. And I, for one, look very much forward to seeing that day and to seeing who those names will be. And I hope that when we reach that day, this show has grown to a point that those voices and those names will come here and they'll have a conversation with me, for you, so that we can learn how they did it. And that's a hopeful note for us to wrap this podcast episode on. If you like what you've heard today, if you don't like what you've heard today, but you're interested in what you've heard and you like the way that we do this program, I ask you to subscribe. You can do so on any of your favorite podcast platforms. You can also find us on YouTube and subscribe to my channel and be the first to get notified when new videos, whether they're clips or full episodes, are posted to the site. And for all of my historical show notes and the past guests, you can find them on my website, brianjmatos.com. You can always reach out to me on Twitter at brianjmatos, and you can find me on Facebook or any number of other social media platforms. I thank you all for taking time to listen to this program, and I invite you all and encourage you all to stay curious.